Imagine you are standing in the wheelhouse. It is 2 in the morning. Horizontal snow is hammering the glass. Suddenly, a red light flickers on the dash. The stress alarm. Then a sound like a gunshot rings through the keel. You are not sinking because of the cold. You are not sinking because of the dark. You are sinking because of a physics equation unique to these inland seas. This is what they saw in their final moments. And this is the real reason the Great Lakes do not give up their dead. November 10th, 1975. A 729-foot freighter, loaded with 26,000 tons of iron ore, is fighting its way across Lake Superior. The captain, Ernest McSorley, is one of the most experienced sailors on the Great Lakes. He is 63 years old. This was supposed to be one of his last voyages before retirement. Around 7 that evening, McSorley radios the ship behind him. He says, "We are holding our own." 10 minutes later, the SS Edmund Fitzgerald vanishes from radar. No distress call, no survivors. All 29 men gone, and the lake has never given back a single body. You have probably heard the song. You might even know the story. But what most people do not understand is that the Edmund Fitzgerald was not some freak accident. It was not even unique. 17 years earlier, a different ship, the Carl D. Bradley, broke in half on Lake Michigan. 33 dead. 8 years before the Fitzgerald, another ship, the Daniel J. Morrell, split apart on Lake Huron. 28 dead. One survivor who spent 38 hours on a life raft in his underwear, watching his crewmates die one by one. All 3 ships broke apart. All 3 went down in November, and all 3 sank because of physics that make these lakes more dangerous than the open ocean. Let us start with the obvious misconception. When people hear Great Lakes, they think lake. Maybe a place you go fishing, maybe somewhere with a nice beach. But these are not lakes in any normal sense. Together, the 5 Great Lakes contain over 20% of the world's surface freshwater. When you stand on the shore of Lake Superior and look out, the horizon vanishes. It looks exactly like the ocean. Ships crossing them travel over 300 miles of open water. That is days at sea. Lake Superior alone is so large that it would take 4 to 5 days to drive around its perimeter. If you could somehow walk across it, from Marquette, Michigan, to Terrace Bay, Ontario, it would take over 2 days. Herman Melville, the author of Moby Dick, wrote about the Great Lakes. He said they possess an ocean-like expansiveness. They are swept by blasts, as direful as any that lash the salted wave. They know what shipwrecks are, for out of sight of land, however inland, they have drowned full many a midnight ship with all its shrieking crew. That was in the 1850s. He was right then. He is still right now. The graveyard beneath those waters is massive. Estimates suggest somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 ships have sunk in the Great Lakes since the 1670s. Some historians put the number even higher. The exact figure is unknown because record-keeping in earlier centuries was spotty at best. What we do know is that an estimated 30,000 people have died in those wrecks. And between 1875 and 1975, a 100-year window, the Great Lakes averaged roughly 1 shipwreck per week, 1 per week, for a century. John U. Bacon, who wrote one of the definitive books on the Edmund Fitzgerald, put it this way: you could be fishing in the morning and fighting for your life by lunch. Only about 15% of these wrecks have ever been found. That means somewhere between 3,600 and 8,000 ships are still out there, sitting on the lake bottoms, undiscovered. So what makes these waters so deadly? Here's the first thing nobody tells you. Freshwater is trying to kill you. Ships float differently depending on what kind of water they are in. Saltwater is denser than freshwater, about 1.025 grams per cubic centimeter compared to 1.0 for fresh. That might sound like a small difference. It is not. Because of that difference in density, ships sit lower in freshwater. approximately 2.5 to 3% deeper than they would in the ocean. It does not sound like much until you realize what it means in practice. More of the hull is exposed to the waves. The ship has less freeboard, less margin between the waterline and the deck. The waves can reach the deck more easily. Water can come aboard more easily. Same cargo, same ship. But now the margin for error is gone. This is why plimsoll marks exist, those lines painted on the side of cargo ships. There is a specific mark for freshwater because marine engineers have always known the Great Lakes require different loading calculations. An ocean vessel entering the Great Lakes sits lower from the moment it arrives. And the ships built specifically for the lakes, the ones that never leave fresh water, are fighting that reduced buoyancy every single day. When storms hit, that difference in buoyancy becomes the difference between surviving and going under. But buoyancy is only part of the story. The bigger problem is the waves themselves, and this is where things get counterintuitive. On the open ocean, waves typically have long periods. The time between one crest and the next might be 20 seconds or more, sometimes 45 to 60 seconds. These are the big rolling swells you have seen in movies. They can be enormous, 30, 40, even 50 feet tall, but they are spaced out. A ship has time to climb one wave, ride over the crest, and prepare for the next. The Great Lakes do not work that way. Because the lakes are enclosed bodies of water, the fetch, the distance the wind can push a wave, is much shorter than on the ocean. Ocean fetch can be thousands of miles. On the Great Lakes, even Lake Superior's longest fetch is only about 200 to 300 miles. And when the fetch is shorter, wave periods get shorter too. On Lake Superior, wave periods during storms can drop to under 10 seconds, often as short as 3 to 5 seconds between crests. John U. Bacon describes the difference this way. Ocean waves are like a soft roller coaster. Great Lakes waves are pointy and closer together, like a mountain range. Guy Meadows, a senior research scientist in Michigan, puts it more bluntly. The waves hit you every 3 to 5 seconds in the Great Lakes, where in the ocean it might be 10 to 12 seconds between waves. The result is devastating for ships. Instead of riding long swells, a vessel on the Great Lakes gets hammered by wave after wave in rapid succession. One wave lifts the bow, another lifts the stern, and for a moment the middle of the ship is suspended over nothing but air. If you have ever tried to snap a stick by bending it over your knee, you know what happens next. The technical term is hogging. That is when the middle of the ship bends upward because the bow and stern are supported by water, but the center is not. Do that enough times, with enough force, and the hull cracks. The waves do not give you time to recover. Before you have shed the water from the first wave, the second one hits, then the third, then the fourth. And there is something else that makes it worse. Salt water tends to blunt waves. The salt helps absorb some of the energy and spread it out. The waves in the ocean are rounded, smoothed by the density of the water. Fresh water does not do that. The waves stay sharp, angular. Some sailors describe them as waffled, choppy, and irregular, coming from multiple directions at once. So you have got a ship sitting lower in the water than it would in the ocean, getting hit by steeper, faster, more punishing waves, with no time to recover between them. And sometimes those waves come in groups. Sailors on Lake Superior have a name for it. They call it the Three Sisters. It is a phenomenon where three massive rogue waves arrive in rapid succession, each one bigger than the last. For years, this was dismissed as folklore, the kind of thing old sailors told each other in bars, a superstition, a myth. But researchers at the University of Wisconsin-Madison have since confirmed that rogue waves absolutely do occur on the Great Lakes. Professor Chin Wu and his research assistant Josh Anderson deployed wave and current measuring instruments throughout the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore. They examined the data for rogue wave patterns, looking at three possible causes: refraction on shoals, diffraction around islands, and reflection off the sandstone bluffs that line much of the area. What they found validated what mariners had been saying for generations. At the sea caves, they observed waves reaching 12.8 feet when the surrounding waves were only 6.1 feet. On Gull Island Shoal, they recorded a wave of 17.7 feet when the average around it was just 8.9 feet. Waves double the size of everything else, appearing suddenly and critically grouped together. If one rogue wave was observed, others cannot be far behind, Anderson reported. They group together during certain wave conditions. The danger with the Three Sisters is that ships cannot shed the water fast enough. The first wave hits and the deck floods. Before the ship can drain, the second wave arrives. Now there is more water than the scuppers can handle. By the time the third wave strikes, the vessel is already compromised, sitting lower, moving slower, unable to climb the next crest. Captain Bernie Cooper of the Arthur M. Anderson, the ship trailing the Edmund Fitzgerald that night in 1975, later reported that his ship was hit by two waves of 30 to 35 feet just before he lost contact with the Fitzgerald. One wave flooded his boat deck and damaged a lifeboat. The second put green water, the solid, powerful center of a wave, onto his bridge deck. His bridge deck was 35 feet above the waterline. The Fitzgerald was just ahead of him. Researchers studying the area found that these rogue waves often form when swells reflect off the rocky shorelines that line much of Lake Superior. The reflected waves combine with incoming waves to create monsters. They cannot say for certain that the Three Sisters sank the Fitzgerald, but they can say the conditions were exactly right for it. The Fitzgerald was not the first ship to break apart under these conditions, and it was not even the deadliest. 17 years before, the Fitzgerald sank, another massive freighter, the Carl D. Bradley was making her final run of the 1958 shipping season on Lake Michigan. The Bradley was 623 feet long. For 22 years, she had been the largest ship on the Great Lakes. She was known for being flexible, a bit bendy, as sailors called it, which made her easier to handle in rough water. That flexibility would kill her. On November 18, 1958, the Bradley was heading home to Rogers City, Michigan, traveling light after delivering a load of limestone. The weather was deteriorating fast. Winds reached 65 miles per hour. Waves hit 30 feet. Around 5:30 that evening, First Mate Elmer Fleming radioed their home port. "We will be in at 2 in the morning." Minutes later, the crew heard a loud thud. Captain Roland Bryan looked aft and saw the stern sagging. Fleming immediately grabbed the radio. "Mayday, Mayday. This is the Carl D. Bradley. Our position is approximately 12 miles southwest of Gull Island. We are in serious trouble. We are breaking up." The captain sounded the general alarm. The engine room was ordered to stop. The whistle blew abandon ship. Then the power failed. The lights in the bow section went out. The Bradley heaved upward, near amidships, and broke in two. The forward section rolled over and sank. The stern section plunged to the bottom. Within minutes, some accounts say less than 5, the Carl D. Bradley was gone. 33 of the 35 crew members died that night. 23 of them were from Rogers City, a town of fewer than 4,000 people. Every street held a funeral. 53 children were orphaned. Only 2 men survived, Frank Mays and Elmer Fleming. They clung to a small life raft for 14 hours in the freezing darkness, riding 30-foot waves before being rescued. Investigators later determined that the type of steel used in the Bradley's construction, and in many ships built before 1948, became brittle in cold water. The hull had been weakened by years of stress from the bending and flexing that made her so maneuverable. When the waves hit at just the wrong angle, the ship simply snapped. 8 years later, it happened again. November 29, 1966, Lake Huron, the SS. Daniel J. Morrell was a 603-foot freighter built in 1906. She was 60 years old, ancient by ship standards, and she was running with only ballast, no cargo. Her sister ship, the Edward Y. Townsend, was traveling the same route. As the storm intensified, winds approaching 65 to 70 miles per hour, waves 30 to 35 feet, the Townsend's captain decided to take shelter in the St. Clair River. The Morrell's captain kept going. At around 2 in the morning on November 29th, the ship began to break apart. Dennis Hale was a 26-year-old watchman from Ashtabula, Ohio. He was asleep in his bunk when he heard a thunderous bang, followed by the ship's alarm. He had no time to dress. He grabbed his pea coat, a life jacket, and ran topside in his underwear. No pants, no shoes. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. The deck of the 603-foot ship was heaving and bending. He could see sparks. He could hear the metal ripping. Real slow, like a piece of paper, he later told NPR. The electrical cable had already broken. No distress call could be sent. At 2:15 in the morning, the ship broke in half. As the crew on the bow section loaded into a life raft, someone shouted that a ship had been spotted off the port bow. It was not another ship. It was the Morrell's own stern section, still powered by the engine, barreling toward them through the darkness. One writer described it as a great wounded beast with its head shot off. The bow sank. The raft was thrown into the lake. The stern kept moving for another 90 minutes before it finally went under. 4 men made it onto the raft. Dennis Hale, Captain Arthur Crawley, First Mate Phil Captis, and Second Mate Duncan McLeod. Over the next 38 hours, Hale watched his 3 crewmates die one by one from the cold. He was alone on the raft, wearing nothing but boxer shorts, a life jacket, and a pea coat, when a Coast Guard helicopter found him the following afternoon. He was nearly frozen, surrounded by the bodies of his friends. He was the only survivor of the Daniel J. Morrell. Hale later credited his lack of clothing with saving his life. The other sailors' clothes had become encrusted with ice, making them heavier, colder. His bare skin, paradoxically, did not trap as much frozen water. He endured more than a dozen surgeries afterward. It took years to regain feeling in his hands and feet. He suffered from what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder for decades. For 15 years, he refused to talk about what happened. When he finally started sharing his story in 1982, he said, "I felt like a huge weight had been lifted off me." Dennis Hale died of cancer in 2015 at age 75. He was the last living witness to a Great Lakes ship breaking apart. So why do these ships break? The official investigations into the Bradley, the Morrell, and the Fitzgerald all reached similar conclusions. Part of it was the steel. Ships built before 1948 were often constructed with steel that had high sulfur content. This made the metal brittle in cold temperatures, exactly the conditions these ships faced every November. When the hull flexed in heavy waves, stress cracks could form. Those cracks could propagate through the metal much faster than they would in modern steel. Part of it was the design. Many Great Lakes freighters were built long and relatively shallow, designed to carry maximum cargo through the locks of the St. Lawrence Seaway. But those long, shallow hulls were vulnerable to hogging and sagging in steep, short-period waves, and part of it was the water itself. Freshwater is less forgiving than saltwater. The reduced buoyancy means ships ride lower. The sharper waves mean more stress on the hull. The shorter wave periods mean that stress is applied again and again, with no rest between impacts. The Fitzgerald, the Bradley, the Morrell, they all faced the same physics, and they all lost. There is also the matter of timing. November is the killing month. Sailors have a name for the storms that roll through the Great Lakes in late fall. They call them the November Witch, or the Gales of November. Gordon Lightfoot was not just being poetic when he wrote about the Witch of November come stealing. Here is why November is so dangerous. Cold, dry air from northern Canada starts pushing south. At the same time, warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico is moving north. These two air masses collide right over the Great Lakes. That would be bad enough on its own. But the lakes have been holding heat all summer and into the fall. The water stays relatively warm late into the season, much warmer than the air above it. When that cold Canadian air sweeps over the warm lake surface, the storm intensifies. The warm water fuels the storm. It adds energy. It adds moisture. And because the lakes are so large, the storm can sit over them for days, building strength, churning the water. The result can be hurricane-force winds, sustained gusts of 90 to 100 miles per hour, waves over 35 feet, whiteout blizzards that blind captains completely. The storm that sank the Edmund Fitzgerald was measured at 978 millibars, equivalent to a borderline Category 1 to Category 2 hurricane. A November 1998 storm was even stronger. 967 millibars, a solid Category 2. And in October 2010, a storm brought Minnesota and Wisconsin their lowest barometric pressures on record. 954 millibars, equivalent to a Category 3 hurricane. Of the 11 deadliest storms to hit the Great Lakes in the last 200 years, 7 of them occurred in November. The most devastating was the Great Storm of 1913, sometimes called the White Hurricane. From November 7th to November 10th, a blizzard with hurricane-force winds tore through all 5 Great Lakes. 12 ships sank outright. 19 more were stranded. At least 250 sailors died. It remains the largest inland maritime disaster in United States history, measured by the number of ships lost. Lake Huron took the worst of it. 8 freighters went down in a single 4-hour window on the night of November 9th. 200 sailors drowned. One captain described his 7-hour journey through the storm as a visit to hell. The storm generated waves over 35 feet, but more dangerous than the height was the behavior. Sailors reported waves that were shorter in length than usual, arriving in rapid succession. Rocky shores reflected the waves back, combining with incoming swells to create unpredictable, chaotic seas. In other words, the exact same conditions that would sink the Fitzgerald 62 years later. And unlike tropical hurricanes, these storms formed directly over the lakes. There is no long approach to track, no days of warning. One moment conditions are manageable. A few hours later, you are fighting for your life. This brings us to the body count. Lake Michigan has the most total shipwrecks, but Lake Erie might be the most dangerous per square mile. It is the shallowest of the Great Lakes, only about 25 to 30 feet deep in its western basin. Some researchers argue it has a greater density of shipwrecks than anywhere else in the world, including the Bermuda Triangle. Shallow water makes waves worse. When waves pass over shallow areas, they slow down. The waves behind them stack up. They grow taller, steeper, and break violently. It is like hitting a wall of water rather than riding a swell. Lake Huron has Shipwreck Alley, a treacherous stretch near Thunder Bay, where fog, sudden gales, and rocky shoals have claimed over 50 vessels in the sanctuary alone. The area around Whitefish Point on Lake Superior has seen at least 240 ships go down since 1816. It is called the graveyard of the Great Lakes. There is an 80-mile stretch of shoreline there with no safe harbor. If a storm catches you, there is nowhere to run. And Lake Superior is especially unforgiving for another reason. The water at the bottom stays around 34 to 36 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. At that temperature, the bacteria that cause decomposition cannot survive. Bodies do not decompose normally. They do not bloat. They do not float back up. Instead, a chemical reaction occurs between minerals in the cold freshwater and human tissue, creating a substance called adipocere, sometimes called corpse wax or the fat of graveyards. This waxy substance preserves the body, in some cases for decades, in some cases maybe indefinitely. There is a body in the wreck of the SS Kamloops, a ship that sank in 1927. The divers have nicknamed Old Whitey. He has been floating in the engine room for nearly 100 years, preserved by the cold water. The Edmund Fitzgerald's 29 crew members are still inside the ship, 530 feet down. The wreck is considered a grave site. Families have requested that divers not disturb it. The lake keeps us dead. Gordon Lightfoot's lyric, Superior, they said, never gives up her dead, is not poetry. It is physics. The Edmund Fitzgerald sank in 530 feet of water, about 17 miles from the safety of Whitefish Bay. It had been the largest ship on the Great Lakes when it launched in 1958. Experienced captain. Crew that had sailed through rough weather before. And even now, 50 years later, the exact cause of the sinking has not been definitively determined. The Coast Guard concluded that the most probable cause was flooding through improperly secured hatch covers. Water gradually filled the cargo hold until the ship lost buoyancy and dove bow first into the lake bottom. But the Lake Carriers Association disagreed. They believed the Fitzgerald had struck 6 Fathom Shoal near Caribou Island earlier in the voyage. Captain Cooper of the Anderson watched on radar as the Fitzgerald passed dangerously close to that shoal. A hull breach there could have been leaking water all afternoon, invisible, irreversible. Others point to structural failure. The ship had been lengthened after its original construction. It was carrying heavier loads than originally designed. In those 35-foot waves, maybe the hull just could not take the stress. And then there is the Three Sisters theory. Captain Cooper reported being hit by 2 massive waves just before losing contact with the Fitzgerald. Those waves, possibly followed by a third, continued in the direction of the Fitzgerald and may have struck it about the same time it sank. What most experts now believe is that it was not one thing. It was everything. A ship possibly damaged by shoaling, taking on water through vents that had been ripped away, carrying maximum cargo in freshwater that provided less buoyancy, being pounded by steep, relentless waves with no time to recover, blinded by snow, no radar, and then maybe 3 massive rogue waves delivering the final blow. McSorley said it was one of the worst seas he had ever been in. 10 minutes after we are holding our own, the ship was gone. Here is what changed. Since the Edmund Fitzgerald sank in 1975, no major commercial ships have been lost on the Great Lakes. 0. The disaster forced a complete overhaul of Great Lakes shipping practices. Mandatory survival suits, better depth finders, GPS positioning systems, increased freeboard requirements, more frequent hull inspections. Weather forecasting improved dramatically. Ships now have access to real-time data that McSorley could not have dreamed of. The 1913 storm that killed 250 people. Forecasters at the time called for moderate to brisk winds. They had no satellites, no radar, no computer models. They were essentially guessing. Today, the National Weather Service can track these storms days in advance. Ships can shelter in port. Captains can make informed decisions. But the lakes themselves have not changed. The physics are the same. The waves still stack up. The Three Sisters still form. The Witch of November still blows through every fall, and there is evidence it may be getting worse. Research from the University of Wisconsin found that over the past 35 years, the overall wave climate on Lake Superior has been increasing. Less ice cover in winter means more open water. More open water means stronger winds can generate larger waves. We found that basically the overall wave climate has been increasing on Lake Superior due to less ice cover and stronger winds in the winter, which generates larger waves, reported Josh Anderson from the Wisconsin Sea Grant study. Climate change is not making the lakes safer. Small boats are still at risk. Kayakers, recreational sailors, anyone who underestimates what these waters can do. The November Witch does not care that you have a GPS. She does not care that you checked the forecast. If you are in the wrong place at the wrong time, the physics will kill you just as efficiently as they killed the crew of the Bradley in 1958, or the Morrell in 1966, or the Fitzgerald in 1975. Every November 10th, the bell from the Edmund Fitzgerald, recovered from the wreck in 1995, tolls at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum in Whitefish Point. It tolls 29 times, once for each crew member lost. Then it tolls a 30th time, for all the sailors who never came home from the Great Lakes. 6,000 ships, maybe more. 30,000 souls, maybe more. All swallowed by waters that look like a lake, but fight like something far worse. Dennis Hale, the sole survivor of the Daniel J. Morrell, was once asked what he would say to his lost shipmates if he could speak to them again. He said that I miss them, that I love them, and I am glad for the time we had together. He spent 38 hours on a life raft in those freezing waters. He never went back on the lakes. The Great Lakes are not the ocean, but do not let anyone tell you they are safer. The lakes do not forgive. The lakes do not forget. And as the saying goes, Superior never gives up her dead.